there, and welcome back to my channel. I'm Brittany Flammer, a financial coach, and I share videos all about budgeting and money saving tips for you and your family. I get asked all the time how we do it with our family of 7 on a low income. So today I'm going to share our money story with you. I'm going to share our journey from just a few $100s to several $100,000 in the span of a few years. If you look at this chart, you see our income for each of the years of our marriage. And you can see it was pretty low for a lot of years. The last couple of years, it has gone up significantly. But our average over the span of 18 years is about $36,000 per year. This is our adjusted gross income. So it's not our gross income, but it's more than our net take-home pay, kind of in the middle. When we first got married, I had a couple $100s in my checking account. My husband had a couple $1,000 set aside, and we did not have any debt. I was in school and we both had to pay for school ourselves. So I had an academic scholarship that covered my tuition. So all I had to pay for was fees and books and my room and board. And I knew from a young age that I'd have to pay for it. So when I was younger in high school, I worked jobs and in the summers, and I saved money for school. So I had enough to cover my expenses, but I also worked during college part-time to cover my rent and my food expenses. My husband also had to pay for his schooling. His bachelor's took him 5 years to get because he was working. He worked 20 plus hours throughout school. At some point, he even worked full-time and went to school on the side. So it took him a little bit longer, but he didn't want to take any debt for school. His master's program, he paid for. He also got a federal grant to cover some of his expenses. So we were both able to graduate debt-free. Our first year of marriage, I was still in school. My husband was done, so he was working. He wasn't working in his field. He was just doing a construction job. It was hourly. The pay was okay, but it was very inconsistent. But from the beginning, we budgeted. I didn't even know what a zero-based budget was at the time, so I wouldn't say I did a zero-based budget. All I did was look at our expenses, the necessary expenses to live, things we had to pay for. I gave us each a little bit of fun money. We each got $50 a month in fun money. We tried to keep our groceries low. We just tried to live frugally and off of the lowest amount we thought he would make. And then if he ever made more than what we needed to live, we would put that money into savings. We spent 2 years as Peace Corps volunteers. We were in Thailand, so we technically didn't earn very much money. They gave us an allowance to live off of. It was like $200 a month or something like that. But we were in a very inexpensive country where that was plenty to live off of. We actually came home with a little bit saved because there was nothing to spend money on where we were in a little village. At the end of Peace Corps, the government gives, or at this point gave every volunteer $6,000 to kind of readjust back to real life. So as a married couple, we got $12,000. Rather than spending this, we invested all of this. We both maxed out our Roth IRA for the year. And then the money we had saved when that first year of marriage, we invested in mutual funds. After Peace Corps for a year, my husband worked while he was applying to grad schools. We had our first baby. So I stayed at home with her. Our insurance, we had hardly any medical expenses with her. Our insurance was great and covered everything for me. And then our income was low enough that Medicaid covered her expenses after she was born. So my husband, we lived with my parents for a few months, and then they left to go on a mission. We stayed in their house to kind of house sit for them, take care of the house. So we lived rent-free, and my husband didn't make very much money, but everything he made, we tried to live frugally and then saved as much as we could for schooling. My husband went to grad school. We went to USC, so we lived in LA, which is extremely expensive. The program my husband did was, if you added up all of the tuition, it was about $100,000. And we knew we did not have that much money set aside, but we really didn't want to go into debt for it. So my husband was working while he was in school. He did a program that was nights and weekends so that people could still work. It was for teachers, so it allowed him to work. So he worked not quite full-time. He worked like 32 hours a week and did schooling night and weekends. So essentially we never saw him. I stayed at home. We had our second child here. She was covered with Medicaid, so we paid for hardly anything for our second child. We lived in it was a 1-bedroom apartment, like 400 square feet. It was so cheap compared to all of the other places around us. The elevator hardly ever worked, so I had to carry our baby and toddler up 3 flights of stairs to get groceries, to go to the park all the time. It was infested with cockroaches. It was awful, but it was cheap. At one point during his grad school, we moved into a studio apartment, which was cleaner and nicer and closer to campus, but was smaller. So it was like 300 something square feet with 2 kids, and I was pregnant with our third. Then he applied and he got a teaching assistantship, TA position, I don't remember what they called it, but where he taught classes to undergrads. That ended up waiving his tuition. So we didn't have to, we only paid like $15,000 or $20,000 of tuition, which we had saved. And then his assistantship covered the rest of his tuition for the following 2 years and gave him a stipend to live off of. So he had more time and we had a little bit more money to live off of. Throughout this, we lived as frugally as we could, but we always paid 10% tithing. We always set some money aside for savings, and then we lived off of the rest. The more kids we had and the more expenses we had, the more important our budget was. So I constantly budgeted. I tried lots of different things, but we were always living on a budget. If you need help with your budget, I do budget webinars. I also do one-on-one financial coaching. Check out links in the description box below if you need help. Our next milestone was spending a year in Turkey. After my husband got his doctorate, he did a fellowship. So he was working for the US, but he essentially taught at a university as kind of like a guest lecturer. So he was a contract employee. They paid him $35,000 to do this for the year. And almost everyone that does this is single. We were the only ones that were married and had kids that did it. But they paid him $35,000 to do it. They paid for his flight over there. There was no insurance, no any other benefits or anything associated with it. But we were given housing for free. So in Turkey, their student housing, it's set up like a US university, but for their student housing, that is actually faculty housing. So they don't have housing for students, they have housing for faculty. So we lived in a dorm room. We had our own kitchen and bathroom, but essentially we lived in a dorm room with 3 kids. We could have gotten a nicer place in the city. A lot of fellows that did this program chose to pay for housing, but we got free housing on campus. So we did that. And then my husband also would go guest lecture at universities throughout the country. And so they wouldn't pay him to do it, but they would pay for his travel to get there and for his housing and food while he was there. So we leased a car for a few months and we would go with him. So our entire family would get to go see all these different places at essentially no cost. While we were in Turkey, we were investing monthly in our Roth IRA. It wasn't a huge amount. I don't even remember, $50 or $100 a month for each of us, but we could live off of the rest. So once again, we donated 10%, we invested some, and then we lived off of the rest. Next up was a year of teaching in Arkansas. My husband was teaching not for a university, it was ESL. He signed a contract for them for 1 year. It was only for $34,000 gross pay. And we weren't sure how we would do that with 3 kids in Arkansas. We were new to the area. So they had housing for students that would come in, and they let us stay in one of their housing units. So we stayed there. My husband did a little bit of maintenance for them. He built some stuff for them, and we stayed there rent free for the school year. And while we were there, he didn't have very good benefits. They didn't have any retirement or anything. We were still contributing to Roth IRA, small amounts. We donated 10%, we invested a little bit and lived off of the rest, but it was really stressful. We knew long-term, they were just letting us stay there for that first year. Long-term, we couldn't afford that on his salary. So he got a new job teaching at a university. So his pay went up only a little bit, but the benefits were awesome. They had great health insurance and dental and all of the insurance. They had a great retirement. They matched 10%. So we put 10% into retirement. They matched 10%. We donated 10% and lived off of the rest. In order to live, at this point, we had 4 kids with 5 on the way, with 5th one on the way. We couldn't live in a tiny apartment, so we bought a duplex, lived in one side, rented out the other side. We did all of the maintenance. We found our tenants. We did everything ourselves to save money. The rent from the second side almost covered the monthly mortgage. We still paid rent of a few $100s into a separate fund So for any expenses that came up, we would have money out of that to pay for any expenses. So we lived there, accumulated a ton of equity during our time there, and we lived with hardly any rent. So we were able to do that, and we continued investing throughout that. Now fast forward, we've moved back to Utah. We have all 5 of our kids. My husband's making double what he was making before, but the same principles still apply. We donate 10%, we invest a good chunk, and then we live off of the rest. Make sure you're subscribed and hit the bell so you get notified when I upload new videos. Thanks so much for watching. See you in the next video.